My family left me in surgery so they wouldn't miss their dream trip to Paris. While I was being wheeled into the operating room terrified and alone, they were boarding a flight and smiling about the vacation they had spent months planning. They thought I would eventually forgive them. What they didn't know was that my grandfather saw everything. And months later, he made sure the entire family did too. Before we dive into it, tell me in the comments where you're from. I love seeing the different places people tune in from. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. My name is Mara Quinn. And until that day, I still believed my family would be there when it mattered most. I had always been the responsible one. I worked hard, paid my own bills, and rarely asked anyone for help. So when doctors told me I needed a major surgery, I was scared but hopeful. The procedure wasn't optional, and there were risks involved. More than anything, I wanted my family beside me. My parents, Dale and Brenda Quinn, had been planning a trip to Paris for nearly a year. My younger brother Ty was going with them. When my surgery was scheduled, I assumed they would delay their vacation. It seemed obvious to me. Family came first. At least, that's what I thought. A week before the operation, I sat at our kitchen table and asked if they could postpone the trip. My voice shook as I explained how nervous I was. Instead of concern, I got excuses. Dad immediately mentioned the money they would lose. Mom said the tickets and hotel reservations were non-refundable. Ty rolled his eyes and said, I would only be in the hospital for a few days anyway. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I reminded them that this wasn't a routine appointment. It was surgery. There could be complications. I told them I was afraid. But no matter what I said, their answer never changed. We'll call and check on you, Mom promised. It'll be fine, Dad added. Their vacation was more important than being there. The morning of the surgery made everything painfully clear. While I sat in a hospital gown trying to stay calm, my family was rushing to the airport. They hugged me quickly, said they would talk to me soon, and left. The room felt empty the moment they walked out. The only person who stayed was my grandfather, Walt Quinn. Grandpa arrived before sunrise carrying a small bag and a worn coffee thermos. He sat beside my bed, talked with me while I waited, and never once looked at the clock. As nurses prepared me for surgery, he held my hand and told me everything would be okay. When they finally came to wheel me toward the operating room, I looked around one last time. My parents weren't there. My brother wasn't there. Only Grandpa stood beside me. In that moment, I realized a painful truth. The people who should have been fighting to stay had chosen to leave. They had picked a vacation over their daughter. And as the operating room doors slowly opened, I had no idea that Grandpa was already paying attention to every excuse, every message, and every selfish decision they made. The first thing I noticed when I woke up was the pain. The second was the silence. For a few seconds, everything felt blurry. Machines beeped somewhere nearby, and the bright hospital lights made it hard to focus. My throat felt dry, and every part of my body seemed heavy. I tried to turn my head, expecting to see my mom, my dad, or even my brother waiting for me. Instead, I saw Grandpa Walt. He was asleep in a hard chair beside my bed, his arms folded across his chest. His neck was bent at an uncomfortable angle, and an untouched cup of coffee sat on the table next to him. It looked like he had never left. The sight brought both comfort and heartbreak. Grandpa was there. Nobody else was. When he noticed I was awake, relief filled his face. He immediately stood up and asked how I was feeling. His voice sounded exhausted, but he smiled anyway. You're through the worst part, he said. I wanted to ask where everyone else was, but deep down, I already knew the answer. Over the next several days, Grandpa became my entire support system. He helped me sit up when moving felt impossible. He brought me water when my hands shook too much to hold the cup. He walked beside me during physical therapy sessions, encouraging me through every painful step. Meanwhile, my parents were enjoying Paris. The messages they sent were short and disappointing. Hope you're feeling better. Sorry we couldn't talk earlier. Today was busy. Every text felt colder than the last. Not once did they ask detailed questions about my recovery. Not once did they offer to come home early. It felt like I was an inconvenience interrupting their vacation. Ty wasn't much different. One message included a picture of a fancy restaurant and a short comment about how amazing the food was. Another talked about sightseeing. I stared at those messages for a long time before putting my phone away. It was becoming impossible to ignore the truth. If our positions had been reversed, I would have canceled everything to be there for them. They hadn't done the same for me. That realization hurt more than the surgery. One afternoon, after a difficult therapy session, I found myself crying quietly while staring out the hospital window. Grandpa didn't ask questions right away. He simply sat beside me. Finally, I admitted what I had been thinking. I don't think they care as much as I thought they did. The words felt terrible to say out loud. Grandpa was silent for a moment. Then he gently placed a hand over mine. Some people would have defended them. Grandpa didn't. Instead, he looked toward my phone resting on the table. People tell you who they are through their actions, he said softly. From that day forward, I noticed something unusual. Every time a text arrived, Grandpa saved it. Every voicemail was kept. Every email was carefully stored away. He never explained why. At the time, I assumed he was simply upset. What I didn't realize was that while I was learning who my family truly was, Grandpa was quietly collecting every excuse, every selfish decision, and every piece of evidence that would someday expose them all. Recovery was supposed to get easier with time. Physically, it did. Emotionally, it got worse. A few days after surgery, I started physical therapy. Every movement hurt. Sitting up was difficult. Walking felt like learning how to use my body all over again. Some days, I made progress. Other days, I felt completely defeated. Through all of it, Grandpa Walt stayed beside me. He drove me to appointments, helped me follow the doctor's instructions, and encouraged me when I felt frustrated. He celebrated every small victory because he knew how hard the recovery process was. My parents, meanwhile, were still in Paris. At first, I kept hoping they would surprise me and come home early. I thought maybe they would realize how serious everything was. Instead, their messages became more disappointing every day. Mom complained about how expensive everything was overseas. Dad talked about long tour lines and crowded attractions. Ty sent messages about famous landmarks he wanted to visit. The strange part wasn't what they said. It was what they didn't say. None of them asked detailed questions about my recovery. Nobody asked what the doctors were saying. Nobody wanted to know how physical therapy was going. Nobody asked if I was scared, hurting, or struggling. Every conversation somehow returned to their vacation. One afternoon, I received a message from Mom. I opened it expecting her to finally ask about my condition. Instead, she explained that they had decided to stay in Paris longer than originally planned. A discounted travel package had become available, and they didn't want to miss the opportunity. I stared at the screen for several seconds. At first, I thought I had misunderstood. Then I read the message again. They were extending the trip. While I was still recovering from surgery, while Grandpa was sleeping in uncomfortable chairs and spending his days helping me heal, while I was struggling to walk without assistance, my family had chosen more sightseeing. For the first time, I stopped making excuses for them. I couldn't blame poor timing anymore. I couldn't blame bad communication. This was a choice. They were choosing themselves. That evening, I sat quietly in the living room while Grandpa read through messages on his phone. I noticed his expression harden. He wasn't a man who lost control easily. Throughout my life, I had rarely seen him angry, but I could tell something was changing. Every text message was saved. Every voicemail was stored. Every email was organized into folders. He carefully recorded dates and details. He never discussed his plans. He never confronted my parents. Instead, he remained calm and patient. The calmer he appeared on the outside, the more concerned I became about what he was thinking. One night, after reading another selfish message from my father, Grandpa slowly placed his phone on the table. His jaw tightened. Then he looked at me and spoke quietly. One day, he said, "People should be held accountable for the things they do." At the time, I thought he was simply expressing frustration. What I didn't realize was that Grandpa had already started building something much bigger than a collection of messages. He was building a record of the truth. A few weeks later, I was finally strong enough to leave the hospital and continue recovering at home. Part of me believed things would improve once my family returned from Paris. I told myself that maybe they had simply made a terrible decision. Maybe once they saw me struggling in person, they would realize how much they had hurt me. I wanted to believe there would be apologies, regret, or at least some genuine concern. Instead, coming home opened my eyes to a much deeper problem. By the time my parents and Ty returned from Paris, the excitement of their trip was all they seemed interested in discussing. Suitcases filled the living room. Souvenirs covered the kitchen table. They talked endlessly about restaurants, museums, and sightseeing adventures, while I sat quietly nearby trying to manage my pain. Not once did anyone ask how difficult recovery had been. Not once did anyone thank Grandpa for everything he had done. The conversation was always about them. A few days later, medical bills started arriving in the mail. I was sitting at the dining table reviewing paperwork when Mom walked in carrying a stack of envelopes. Instead of asking how I was feeling, she immediately began complaining about the cost. "I can't believe how expensive all of this is," she said while shaking her head. "These bills just keep coming." I stared at her in disbelief. I had gone through a major surgery, weeks of pain, and a difficult recovery process. Yet somehow the biggest inconvenience in her mind was the paperwork. Ty wasn't any better. Every day he seemed to find another excuse to talk about Paris. He showed off souvenirs, described famous landmarks, and shared stories about things he had bought during the trip. He seemed completely unaware of how painful it was to listen to him celebrate a vacation that had mattered more to my family than being there for me. The worst conversation happened with my father. One evening, I finally admitted how abandoned I had felt during the surgery and recovery. I wasn't yelling or trying to start an argument. I simply wanted him to understand the damage their decision had caused. Instead, he dismissed my feelings immediately. "Mara, you're being dramatic," he said. "You're acting like we never cared about you." His words hit harder than I expected, because deep down, I wasn't questioning whether they cared. I was questioning how much. From across the room, Grandpa Walt watched the entire exchange. He didn't interrupt, but I noticed the disappointment in his eyes. Over the following weeks, he observed every conversation, every careless comment, and every selfish reaction. Slowly, he began realizing something I hadn't fully accepted yet. This wasn't a single mistake. This wasn't about Paris. This was a pattern that had existed for years. Looking back, I started seeing things differently too. Ty had always come first. My accomplishments had often been ignored. My sacrifices had been expected. The surgery had simply exposed what had always been there. For the first time in my life, I began wondering whether I truly had a place in the family I had spent years trying so hard to please. As the weeks passed, my recovery slowly improved. I could move around more easily, handle basic tasks on my own, and spend less time thinking about the surgery. The physical pain was fading, but the emotional damage remained. I had stopped expecting much from my family. It hurt less that way. At the same time, Grandpa Walt seemed unusually busy. At first, I didn't think much of it. He spent a lot of time in his home office, sorting through old boxes and filing cabinets. Whenever I visited, papers would be spread across his desk. Sometimes he was reading old letters. Other times he was looking through folders or organizing documents. When I asked what he was working on, he always gave a simple answer. Just cleaning up old records. I believed him. What I didn't know was that Grandpa had started looking much deeper into our family's history. The surgery and Paris trip had bothered him, but the more he thought about it, the more he questioned whether it had really been an isolated incident. He began revisiting years of family memories and comparing them with what actually happened. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Ty had always received special treatment. When Ty wanted expensive sports equipment, my parents found the money. When I needed help with something important, I was told to be patient. When Ty made mistakes, excuses were made for him. When I struggled, I was expected to handle it myself. Grandpa started gathering proof. He found old messages where family events had been rearranged around Ty's schedule while my commitments were ignored. He found receipts showing expensive gifts bought for Ty while my birthdays were treated as afterthoughts. He discovered emails, notes, and records that revealed the same story again and again. The more he looked, the more examples he found. It wasn't 1 year. It wasn't 2 years. It stretched back through most of my life. Meanwhile, I was focused on rebuilding myself. I returned to work part-time and gradually regained my independence. Physical therapy became easier. I spent more time with friends and less time trying to earn approval from people who rarely gave it. For the first time in years, I started making decisions based on what I wanted instead of what would keep everyone else happy. Something inside me was changing. I felt stronger, more confident, more willing to accept the truth. My family noticed the difference too, though they didn't seem to understand why. They assumed time had healed everything. They believed the Paris situation was behind us. Grandpa knew better. Every week, his collection grew larger. Messages were printed and organized. Letters were sorted by date. Records were carefully stored in folders. He documented everything with incredible patience. Yet he never told me the full extent of what he was doing. I had no idea how much evidence he had gathered or how far back his investigation had gone. All I knew was that whenever he looked at those files, there was a determination in his eyes I had never seen before. Whatever Grandpa was building, he wasn't doing it out of anger alone. He was preparing for something. After everything that happened, I eventually reached a point where I had to make a choice. I could spend the rest of my life feeling hurt by what my family had done, or I could focus on rebuilding myself. The truth was that I couldn't change their behavior. I couldn't force them to care. What I could control was what happened next, so I stopped waiting for an apology that was never going to come. I threw my energy into recovery, work, and creating a better future for myself. Returning to work felt strange at first. My confidence had taken a serious hit during the months after surgery. Part of me still carried the feeling that I wasn't important enough for the people closest to me to show up when I needed them. But each week I grew stronger. My coworkers welcomed me back warmly, and for the first time in a long while, I felt appreciated. It reminded me that not everyone in my life viewed me as an afterthought. Outside of work, I focused on improving my health. I stayed committed to my physical therapy exercises even after the hardest part of recovery was over. Every milestone felt like proof that I was moving forward. I could walk farther, move easier, and live more independently than before. The progress wasn't always fast, but it was steady, and that was enough. Something else started changing too. I began spending more time with people who genuinely cared about me. Friends who had checked on me during my recovery remained close. We met for coffee, shared meals, and spent time together on weekends. They listened when I needed to talk, and never treated my feelings like a burden. Being around them showed me what real support looked like. For the first time, I stopped measuring my worth through my family's approval. Through all of it, Grandpa Walt remained my biggest supporter. He never pushed me to forgive anyone. He never pressured me to move on before I was ready. Instead, he encouraged me to focus on myself and build a life that made me happy. Whenever I doubted myself, he reminded me how far I had come. The stronger I became, the more obvious it was that my parents had learned absolutely nothing. In their version of events, the Paris trip had become old news. Whenever relatives visited, Mom and Dad acted as though everything was perfectly normal. They talked about family values, togetherness, and how proud they were of their children. Anyone listening would have believed we were the perfect family. The image mattered more to them than the truth. They were constantly focused on appearances. Every family gathering, holiday celebration, and conversation with relatives seemed carefully managed to maintain that image. Meanwhile, Grandpa quietly continued his work. His collection of messages, emails, receipts, and records kept growing. Every time my parents contradicted themselves or tried to rewrite history, another piece of evidence was added to his files. I occasionally noticed him reviewing documents late at night, but he never explained what he planned to do with them. He wasn't acting out of anger. He wasn't looking for revenge. He was waiting patiently for the right moment. While my parents focused on protecting their reputation, Grandpa was preparing for the day when the truth would finally catch up with them. Neither of us knew exactly when that day would come. But deep down, I had a feeling it was getting closer with every passing week. Several months passed, and life slowly settled into a new routine. My recovery was mostly behind me, work was going well, and I had learned to keep my expectations of my family low. Things were peaceful, but there was still an uncomfortable distance between us that never completely disappeared. Then my parents announced they were planning a huge celebration for their wedding anniversary. The event was going to be one of the largest family gatherings we had held in years. Relatives from different states were invited. A banquet hall was reserved months in advance. My mother spent weeks talking about decorations, food, and guest lists. My father seemed obsessed with making sure everything looked perfect. As usual, appearances were their top priority. When I first heard about the celebration, I had no interest in attending. The thought of spending an entire evening pretending everything was normal sounded exhausting. I wasn't looking for another argument, but I also wasn't interested in playing the role of the happy daughter while everyone ignored what had happened. For several days, I planned to decline the invitation. Then, Grandpa Walt called. His voice sounded calm, but there was something unusual about his tone. "I think you should come," he said. I immediately told him I wasn't sure it was a good idea. After everything that had happened, family gatherings felt uncomfortable. Every conversation seemed forced. Every smile felt fake. Grandpa listened patiently before speaking again. "Trust me," he said. "Just be there." The request surprised me. Over the previous months, Grandpa had never pressured me into attending family events. He had always respected my decisions. The fact that he was asking now made me pause. When I asked why it mattered so much, he simply told me that some things deserved to happen in front of witnesses. The answer raised more questions than it solved. Still, I trusted him, more than anyone else in the family, so I agreed to attend. As the anniversary celebration drew closer, I began noticing small things that felt strange. Grandpa seemed unusually focused. He spent more time organizing papers and reviewing documents. Several times I walked into his office and found folders spread across his desk. Whenever he noticed me looking, he would quietly close them. He never explained what he was doing. Meanwhile, my parents continued preparing for their big night. They talked endlessly about how wonderful it would be to have the entire family together. They wanted everything to be memorable. Ironically, they were about to get exactly what they wished for. The closer the event came, the more tension I felt. I couldn't explain it. Nothing obvious was happening, yet there was a growing sense that something important was approaching. Grandpa seemed calm, but beneath that calmness was a determination I had never seen before. Whatever he had been working on for all those months was connected to this gathering. I didn't know what he planned to do. I didn't know what evidence he had collected. But as relatives began arriving from across the country and the anniversary celebration finally approached, I had a strong feeling that the Quinn family was about to face a truth they could no longer avoid. The night of my parents' anniversary celebration finally arrived, and the banquet hall was filled with relatives, family friends, and people who had known the Quinn family for years. Laughter echoed through the room as guests shared stories, enjoyed dinner, and congratulated my parents on their marriage. From the outside, everything looked perfect. That was exactly how my parents wanted it. My mother moved from table to table greeting guests with a smile. My father proudly welcomed relatives who had traveled long distances to attend. Ty spent the evening joking with cousins and enjoying the attention. Looking around the room, nobody would have guessed how much pain and resentment had been hidden behind that polished image. I sat quietly beside Grandpa Walt for most of the evening. He seemed calm, but I could tell he was waiting for something. Then, shortly after dinner, he slowly stood up from his chair. At first, nobody thought much of it. Many guests assumed he was about to give a simple anniversary toast. After all, he was the oldest member of the family and one of the most respected people in the room. My father even smiled proudly as he handed Grandpa a microphone. The room gradually fell silent. Everyone turned their attention toward him. Grandpa thanked everyone for attending and congratulated my parents on their anniversary. For a brief moment, it sounded exactly like the speech everyone expected. Then, everything changed. Instead of continuing with happy memories, Grandpa opened a large folder he had brought with him. The smile disappeared from my father's face. Grandpa calmly explained that before celebrating family, he believed honesty should come first. The room immediately grew quieter. He began with the story of my surgery. He described the date, the circumstances, and the fact that I had asked my family to stay with me during one of the most frightening moments of my life. Then he started reading. One by one, he read the messages my parents and brother had sent before and after the surgery. He read every excuse, every complaint, every selfish explanation. Guests listened as he repeated their exact words. The room became uncomfortably silent. My mother looked shocked. My father kept trying to interrupt, but Grandpa continued. He read messages discussing vacation plans while I was recovering in a hospital bed. He read conversations about sightseeing, restaurants, and travel expenses. He read the message explaining why they had decided to extend their trip while I was still struggling through recovery. Every sentence seemed worse than the one before it. The silence in the room became almost unbearable. Several relatives exchanged stunned looks. Others stared directly at my parents. For years, they had carefully built the image of a loving and devoted family. They had spent countless gatherings presenting themselves as caring parents who always put family first. Now that image was cracking apart in front of everyone. But Grandpa wasn't finished. He presented records, emails, and documents showing years of favoritism toward Ty and neglect toward me. He explained how the surgery wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern that stretched back through most of my life. Nobody could dismiss it as a misunderstanding anymore. The evidence was too clear. As Grandpa closed the folder and stepped away from the microphone, the room remained completely silent. For the first time, the truth was no longer hidden behind smiles, excuses, or carefully crafted appearances. Everyone could finally see the Quinn family exactly as it was. The silence that followed Grandpa Walt's speech felt endless. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The room was filled with stunned faces as relatives tried to process everything they had just heard. The evidence was sitting right in front of them. The messages had been read aloud. The dates matched. The records were clear. For the first time, there was no way to explain it away. My father was the first to react. He quickly grabbed the microphone and tried to dismiss everything as a misunderstanding. He claimed Grandpa had taken things out of context and exaggerated the situation. My mother immediately joined him, insisting that they loved me and that the Paris trip had simply been a difficult decision. But something was different this time. Nobody seemed eager to accept their explanations. The usual sympathy they expected never came. Instead, relatives began asking questions, hard questions, questions they couldn't easily avoid. One aunt asked why they hadn't returned home when complications were possible. A cousin wanted to know why extending the vacation had been more important than supporting their daughter. Another relative asked why none of their messages showed any real concern for my recovery. The answers sounded weak even as they spoke them. As the conversations continued, something unexpected happened. Old family tensions started rising to the surface. People who had remained silent for years finally began sharing their own observations. One relative admitted they had noticed that Ty always seemed to receive special treatment growing up. Another remembered family events being rearranged around his schedule while my commitments were ignored. Someone else mentioned birthdays, holidays, and celebrations where the differences had been obvious. Story after story emerged from different corners of the room. None of them were shocking to me. What surprised me was hearing other people say them out loud. For years, I had often wondered whether I was imagining the favoritism. I had questioned myself more times than I could count. Now I was discovering that other people had seen it too. They had simply chosen not to say anything. My parents looked increasingly uncomfortable as more relatives spoke up. Ty tried defending himself, insisting he had done nothing wrong. But every attempt to justify the situation only seemed to make things worse. The carefully crafted image they had spent years protecting was collapsing right in front of them. Throughout the entire ordeal, I said very little. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't need to. Grandpa had already presented the facts. The messages spoke for themselves. The records spoke for themselves. The years of evidence spoke for themselves. For the first time in my life, I wasn't being portrayed as overly sensitive, dramatic, or ungrateful. People could finally see the truth with their own eyes. By the end of the evening, the anniversary celebration had become something nobody expected. Instead of celebrating my parents, relatives left questioning everything they thought they knew about our family. The reputation Dale, Brenda, and Ty had spent years building suffered enormous damage. Not because anyone attacked them, but because the truth had finally been given a chance to speak, and once everyone saw it, there was no putting it back in the shadows. The months following the anniversary gathering changed the Quinn family forever. My parents tried repeatedly to repair the damage. They called relatives, arranged meetings, and offered explanations for what had happened. They insisted Grandpa Walt had embarrassed them unfairly and claimed the situation had been misunderstood. But for the first time, very few people were willing to listen. The problem wasn't what Grandpa had said. The problem was that he had proof. The messages, emails, and records couldn't be explained away. People had seen the evidence with their own eyes. The excuses that once worked no longer carried any weight. Ty faced consequences as well. For years, he had enjoyed being the center of attention, while rarely considering how his actions affected others. Now relatives viewed him differently. Many stopped treating him like the innocent favorite child. Some openly criticized his behavior, while others simply became distant. For perhaps the first time in his life, he was forced to face the reality that people were holding him accountable. As for me, something inside me finally changed. I stopped chasing approval from people who had never truly valued me. For years I had worked hard to earn their attention, their praise, and their support. I believed that if I tried hard enough, eventually they would treat me the way I deserved to be treated. The surgery and everything that followed taught me otherwise. Once I accepted that truth, a huge weight lifted from my shoulders. Instead of focusing on what I had lost, I focused on what I still had. I invested more time in my career, strengthened my friendships, and continued building a life filled with people who genuinely cared about me. The peace that came with letting go was something I had never experienced before. Through all of it, Grandpa Walt remained by my side. He never celebrated what happened at the anniversary gathering. He never acted proud of exposing anyone. As far as he was concerned, he had simply made sure the truth was heard. And because of his actions, the truth could never be buried again. The story my parents spent years creating had finally been replaced by reality. One evening, many months later, I sat with Grandpa on his porch watching the sun disappear beyond the trees. We talked about ordinary things, laughed about old memories, and enjoyed the quiet. As I looked at him, I realized something important. Family isn't defined by shared names, holidays, or blood. Family is the person who stays when everyone else leaves, the person who sits beside your hospital bed, the person who helps you stand when you're struggling, the person who chooses you when others don't. When I needed someone most, only one member of my family stayed, and that taught me everything I needed to know about what family truly means.